Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot, daf Mem Bet. A few announcements before we start. Number one, I will be away this week, which means, first of all, I'll be in Chicago speaking. So if anybody is in Chicago, wants to hear me speak, I'll be speaking Tuesday evening. You can email us for details if you haven't seen them out there. That's number one. Number two, because I'll be away, so all the dafim were pre-recorded from Tuesday through to the end of the week. So there will be no live Zoom from Tuesday till the end of the week. We'll start back up again on Zoom on Sunday. All the shiurim will be up at 7 a.m. in New York time. Everything will be up on the site. Okay, those are my announcements. A few other things that I didn't mention last week, which I should have, which is the Beyond the Daf content. Sometimes I just forget to mention. So flashback was about Rabbi Ishmael and his ways of darshaning the Torah, the Yugimel Midot and the different approaches of Rabbi Ishmael. What made his approach unique about how he darshaned the Torah, that was one. And that came up because, if you remember, we had two approaches to what Rabbi Ishmael's method of darshaning was. In that case, then we also have Din and Daf went up on the very interesting topic that we spent a lot of time about the shatnez in the tzitzit, right? And entitled, when do the ends justify the means? And right, when a positive mitzvah can override a negative commandment, and the whole concept. So definitely interesting material to delve into. Okay, we're getting to some other interesting material. There'll be an interesting gefet tomorrow about women and mitzvot, and are women allowed to do mitzvot that are time-bound and they're exempt from. So that's going to come up about, we're going to see a teeny bit about women today, but the real sugya in tzitzit and women is in tomorrow's daf. Something to look forward to. Okay, we're going to get started now from the bottom of Mem Aleph Amud Bet. So what we saw in yesterday's shiur was that it sounded like there's specific requisite amounts for how long the tzitzit need to be. So it says, we're going to start about 6 lines from the bottom. Does that mean that there's a shiur for tzitzit? Uriminu, that contradicts the following source. Tzitzit, it says tzitzit in the Torah, ain't tzitzit ela yotze, ain't tzitzit ela mashu. Right? Tzitzit means it has to come down after like the twinings, and ain't tzitzit ela mashu, but it could be even just any amount. Ukvar alu ziknei Beit Shammai v'ziknei Beit Hillel aliyat Yochanan ben Betera v'amru, and the elders of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel went to the attic of, the upper story of Yochanan ben Betera. A lot of times that's where the rabbis congregated, in the second floor of houses. And they said, they determined tzitzit ein la shiur, there's no requisite amount for tzitzit. Kayotze bo, and just like tzitzit there isn't, lulav ein bo shiur, there's no requisite amount for a lulav. My lav ein la shiur klal, right? Sounds like it. There's no requisite amount. So how do you explain that in light of all those shiurim the rabbis gave, right? Remember, we're talking much later rabbis. They were Moraim and, third generation. They're already, or second to third generation. And they're discussing these topics, right? That way back before them, they seem to say there is no requisite amount. So why are these rabbis assuming there's a requisite amount and disagreeing? Is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 3? So low. No, that's not the way. Oh, so my lav, ein la shiur klal, right? Sounds like there's no shiur at all from what they said. Ein la shiur means there's no requisite amount. Lo, ein la shiur lamala v'yesh la shiur lamata. No, they say, no. What we meant is there's no maximum amount of maximum length that it needs to be. There's a minimum length that it needs to be, and that's what all those rabbis were discussing. We just meant, the Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel meant there's no maximum amount. Now, how do we know that this is the case? Because if you don't say that, let's put the two, right? We have lulav and we have tzitzit. Tzitzit, we don't really know, let's say. Okay, perhaps that's what they meant. But by lulav, you can't possibly say there's no minimum amount because, right, you're going to say there's no minimum length of the lulav. It says in the Mishnah explicitly that there's a requisite amount. Lulav sheyesh bo shoshat tvachim kedei l'na'anea bo kashel. As long as it has 3 handbreadths and it's enough that you can shake the lulav, then it's kasher. So therefore, it must be what they're trying to say is, okay, there's no maximum. I'm trying to think of, really gigantic, right? You see those, I don't know if you've ever seen them in the ship with the Teimani etrogim are gigantic, right? So imagine a gigantic lulav, right? You can go as high as you want. Okay, what they're talking about. There's no maximum length to how long the lulav can be, and same thing with the tzitzit. So again, they're going to say, likewise here by tzitzit, we're going to say the same thing, because if in the same mouth mouthful, they said both lulav has no shiur and tzitzit have no shiur, and if lulav is going to be explained, well, there's no maximum length, then tzitzit is going to be hachanami. Also by tzitzit, we're going to say ein lo shiur l'mala v'yesh lo shiur l'mata. It does have a minimum. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan, tzitzit ain't tzitzit ela anaf. When we say tzitzit, the word tzitzit makes reference to specifically the strings that are hanging down beyond the twinings. Remember, the gedilim are the twinings. What they're saying here is the tzitzit or the anaf, what we call the anaf, which is not the gedil, but the part that's hanging down loose. V'cheinu omer, how do we know this from a pasuk? V'yikacheni b'tzitzit roshi. Okay, there's a pasuk in Yechezkel, chapter 8, verse 3, where it says, Yechezkel is describing this vision, and it says, there was a tavnit yad, this hand came out and grabbed me by the strands of my hair, okay, with the locks of my hair. So there you see that hair is not braided, right? It's just loose, and that's what we're talking about. They need to be separated like the hair of like a Gentile haircut. What they're talking about is they would have it braided and then it would be hanging loose. So it's a perfect example of the tzitzit. First it's braided, then it's hanging loose. Okay? Some people say that based on this, because he actually says tarich lefarude, to separate them, some people have the custom to take their tzitzit when they put them on and separate them with their fingers. Make sure they're separate strings. Tanu Rabbanan, hitil ala keren o ala gdil kshera. If you put it exactly on the corner, okay, now we say put it on the corners of your garment. What if you put it exactly at that corner where, the two sides meet at exactly the corner, or on the gedil? Now the gedil is not, before we talked about the gedilim, which are the twinings. Here they mean, the Rashi explains, the hem sewed around it's right around the corner. If you take like an L shape around the corner, there's stitches on the end. So if you put it either in that corner piece or on any part of the L, they're basically saying either the corner of the L where the two sides meet or the rest of the L on the edge of the garment, kshera. That's okay, meaning it's not the ideal place to put it, but it's kshera. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov posel b'shtein. He says none of these are good, because what do you have to do? You have to put it in the garment the way we do, right? It's a few centimeters or a little bit inward, okay? And that's usually, right, there's a hole there and then the strings hang down, right? Presumably, one of the reasons I can imagine is if you put it very close to the edge, it's much more likely to fall off and rip and tear, okay? It's not clear why, but one says it's okay, one says it's not. So now they say, Keman az lahad amar Rav Gidol amar Rav. According to who does this statement that we're about to see? Notice his name is Rav Gidol. Sometimes we see that where the name matches what we're talking about the Gedil. So Rav Gidol says in the name of Rav, it needs to be, now here there's different interpretations, but it sounds like it says it needs to be, okay, basically somewhere in the garment, not at the edge, but it needs to be hanging over the corner, like maybe even touching physically the corner, that when the tzitzit hang over, right, imagine the tzitzit, there's a hole, and then there's the tzitzit, they're hanging, they touch the corner of the garment. Shneimar al kamfei bidehem, because it says put them on the corners of your garment, meaning they have to be touching the corners of your garment, right? They're not actually coming out of the corners of your garment. That's no good, but they do need to be touching over, right, going over the corner of your beged. Keman Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov. This seems to match Rav Eliezer ben Yaakov, who says that the tzitzit can't be on the corner, and therefore they must be hanging over the corner, because obviously the corner plays a role somewhere here. Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, but tzarich shirchik melo kesher gudal, continuing in, well, where exactly do they need to be placed? He says you need to move it, you need to distance it 1 full thumb joint away from the corner. Now it sounds like we mean a full thumb joint, right, from the top of the thumb till the first knuckle there. Some people say it's the whole thumb, basically, to the second knuckle, which then comes to about 3 etzbaot. That's about the same as 3 finger breadths width, which is the amount we saw yesterday, if you remember, right? In the end, that was the psak, that it's 3 finger breadths away, right? If you remember, and today we're going to talk about what's the connection between these two things, like why do you need them both? Okay, if you remember, we said, Rav Papa said, the halacha is arba bitoch shalosh, right? They have to be 4 finger breadths long, and then within 3 of 3 finger breadths of the corner. So it's possible this is the same amount. It's likely that it's a little bit less. Okay, and then we're going to talk about the interplay between the two. It's drift Rav Papa. We need the psak of Rav Papa that that it can be three, right? That the measurement is 3 handbreadths away from the corner. And it's Rabbi Yaakov that you have to distance it from the corner at least 1 finger, right? 1 thumb joint away. So why do we need these both? And what's the interplay between them? Well, De'imi Rav Papa hava mina toch shalosh. Right? What does Rav Papa say? It has to be within 3 from the corner. Okay, it doesn't say it has to be at the point of 3. So because he said it has to be within 3 of the corner, you might have thought, hava mina, I would have thought toch shalosh deloli rachik tfei, meaning you can't put it further in the garment more than 3 finger breadths away. But kama demikarev ma'ale, but maybe you actually, in other words, that's the outer limit or inner limit, right? Move it in the baguette only up to 3. But really, the closer you are to the edge, the better. That's what you might have thought. That's why it's strict to Rabbi Yaakov. That's why you need Rabbi Yaakov to tell you, no. Don't get too close to the edge. Okay, this again goes back to like the minimum and the maximum is before. It's now, obviously, we're not talking about the same issue. That was how long the strings are. This is one saying, right, you can't go in more than 3, but you also can't go out unless, right, you can't be so close to the edge of the garment either. The image of Rabbi Yaakov, now if you just said, make sure it's 1 full thumb joint away from the corner, havamina below kesher gudal delo lekarif tvei, don't be any closer than that, but kama derachik male, but maybe you're better off going as further into the garment as you can. Tzriche, and that's why you need a Rav Papa to say, no, don't go too far in. So it's basically saying these are your, it's not a lot of wiggle room that you have, but this is it. Right? Don't go too far to the edge, don't go too far into the garment. And that's the interplay between the two. Now we have a story. Ravina v'Rav Sama havuyat bekamei de Rav Ashi. This story teaches you sometimes it's better to keep your mouth closed when you see something you don't think is right. So, right, oftentimes we say, well, you should say something, but let's see what happens to Rav Sama. So Ravina and Rav Sama were sitting before Rav Ashi. Chazir Rav Sama lekarni de glime de Ravina, distar uvetzar mimlo kesher gudal. So Rav Sama saw the corner of Ravina's garment, that it was torn. Okay, the corner of his garment tore off a little bit. And now, bitzar mimelo kesher gudal, the tzitzit were less than this thumb joint away from the edge, because originally it was fine, but now it tore, so the edge of the garment moved further in, and now you don't have the minimum amount. So Amar says to him, Lo sara l'amal lahad Rabbi Yaakov, do you not hold by where Rabbi Yaakov says that it can't be that distance from the corner? Amar le b'shat asiyah itmar. He said, Ravina immediately responds, he says, that halacha that has to be a full thumb joint away is only when you're making the tzitzit. Mine were obviously made properly. They just tore. That doesn't matter. Like once it's already there, you can leave it. Okay, and that kind of goes with what I said before, that the concern is that it might tear off, so make it properly to minimize tearing. But if it tears a little bit, the baguette, so as long as your tzitzit are still there, you're good. Well, Rav Sama, he got very embarrassed, right? Because here he opened his mouth. He criticized what Ravina was doing, and Ravina put him in his place and said, you're completely wrong. You didn't understand the sugya at all. So he's very embarrassed. So Rav Ashi says the following statement to make you feel better. You can decide whether this would have made you feel better or not. Amar le Rav Ashi, lo tat kiflach. Don't get offended by this. Cha minayu kitrei minan. One of them are like 2 of us, okay? Like, we're just not as worthy as they are, okay? Ravina, now, this statement is a tricky statement because this statement is often made in the context of, and Rashi quotes it, Chad minayu mi b'nei Eretz Yisrael. What's minayu? From them are the people from Israel. One of the Israeli rabbis is worth 2, like we're 2 of us are as good as one of them. And Rashi says Ravina was from Eretz Yisrael. Now there's a big debate about whether this is really the case, whether he really was. Some people just say that he was from a different city, and the point was saying the people from that city are like the people in Eretz Yisrael. They have a better reputation than we do, and don't let that get you down. Okay, he just happens to be incredibly sharp. Okay, the other option is, by the way, he could have just been borrowing the term about the Israelis and saying that's like Ravina. He's in a different league. Okay, so don't try to compare yourself to him because he's just way smarter than both of us. And what was nice about Rav Ashi is he was putting himself in that category. Now we all know Rav Ashi was a huge. He appears almost on every sugya of Shas. He also is credited with putting together the editing of the Gemara. So anyway, but he's putting himself down as well, which is a nice way to make Rav Sama feel better. Okay. On the other hand, it's also a little bit putting Rav Sama down and saying you're not worth as much as Ravina is. But okay. Rav Acha bar Yaakov Rami Arba'a va'ayif lumeaf. Now we're going to get into the how you make the tzitzit, how you string the tzitzit inside. Okay, not exactly all the details about how to do it, but the question is, when you start out and you put it through the hole, okay, I happen to have a cord here. Okay, it's not a string, but it's a charger cord. It'll work for our purposes. Okay, you could just imagine instead of one, there's four. Okay, so here's our charger cord. I make do with what I find on my desk. Luckily, I have things on it. So he would take Rami Arba. He would take 4 strings. Okay, v'ayif luhumeaf. That's what I did here. I folded them. Okay, he folded all 4 strings. He ends up with 8 strings, and then ma'ayale beglima v'avit lumevak. So what would he do? He would put them in as 8. Now, normally when we think about putting tzitzit, I imagine, at least the way I think about it, and we're going to see why I think about it this way and why maybe you do, which is you would think that you take the 4, okay, you take them, you put them inside, right? And then you fold them over, right? They get folded by putting them inside, right? Then you take the top part there where they're folded. That's at the top of the tzitzit, and then everything else hangs down. And that's how you get from 4 to 8. But he says, no. You first fold them, then you loop them in. And then what do you do after? Well, you take all the other strings then, right? And you pull them through the loop. And with that, you get a nice knot. Okay, and then they're knotted on your tzitzit. That's what he says to do. So I'm going to read it inside again. Rami Arba, he would take 4. Ayif luhumeach, he would put them inside, right? Fold them. Ma'ayaluhu biglima, then put them in the glima. Va'avik le'mevak, and then he would loop them through and end up with the knot there. Okay, and then from there you do the twinings. Kasavar, why did he say this? Because he thought be'inan timnaya beglima. You need 8. This is the key. You need them to go in. When you put them in the garment, they need to already be 8 and not be 4 that form into 8 once they're already on the garment. He thought you have to put 8 in at once. Little hard to see how exactly he gets this. But he says there's gedil, which is 2. Gedilim is 4. And then somehow he jumps from there to 8, like he thinks you have to double that. Okay? Bimkom ptil, what he means is, because it talks about the ptil tchelet, the place where you're putting them in. In other words, he gets from gedilim to 8, and then he says they have to be 8 when you're stranding them, okay, when you're putting them through the garment. Rav Yirmiyah Difti, Rami Timnaya, De'inu Shitzar. Rav Yirmiyah Difti would put 8 that became 16. Okay, he had different tzitzit than we did. We have 4 that become 8. His was 8 that became 16, and he didn't do this thing about folding it over. He would just do 8, put 8 in, then loop them in. You know, they would then inside they would turn into 16 once they were in already. So it kind of is similar in the sense that 8 went in. It's just not in the same manner. Okay, velo avik luhu, but he wouldn't do this trick of tying the loop knot right from the beginning, putting it in as the loop, and then tying it around. Mar B'rei Ravina avik kedidan. Okay, Mar B'rei Ravina though does like we do. Okay, which is funny because what we do is like him. Okay, they're saying like we do, meaning the people of his time. Okay, and that's where we put 4 in. Then once it goes inside the hole, then you end up with 8, and then you start the knot, and then the twinings, and then knot twinings, etc. Rav Nachman Eshkechel Rav Adar bar Ava. Okay, now we're going to get into the bigger part of our sugya today. This is going to take up about half of our daf, which is this sugya about making a bracha on making the tzitzit. Do you make a bracha when you make the tzitzit? We're going to start off with a big machloket between Rav Adar bar Ava and Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman Eshkechel sees Rav Adar bar Ava, Rami Chute, he sees him putting chutim in the tzitzit, putting the strings in, become a varech lasot tzitzit, and he makes a bracha lasot tzitzit. Amar le, my tzitzit shamani. He says, what's this tzitzit that I hear? What's this noise I hear? He's obviously making a play on words of the tzitzit and the tzitzit. He says, what's this noise I hear? In other words, why are you making a bracha? I hear a bracha. What's going on here? Hachi amar Rav. He says, didn't you know the Rav said, tzitzit ain't sricha bracha. You don't make a bracha on making the tzitzit. When do you make a bracha? When you put them on. The bracha is not on making the tzitzit. And this is a whole question in general. Okay, we're going to get to, do you make a bracha when you build a sukkah? Do you make a bracha when you make your tefillin? Okay, these are all preparing something for a mitzvah that's going to be done later, right? Do you make a bracha on the actual act of making the item? So, Rav Nachman clearly says no, based on Rav, and Rav Adar bar Ava thought yes. So now we're going to have we're going to hear I'll just start without any introduction. Kinach nafshei de Rav Huna. When Rav Huna died, al Rav Chisda lemirma Rav Adarav. Rav Chisda comes in the Beit Midrash. Okay, this is not coincidental that Rav Huna died and then Rav Chisda came in the Beit Midrash. And if you remember this sugya, but there's a sugya in Bava Metzia where Rav Chisda goes to Rav Huna and asks him. There's a whole question about a rabbi. What's the order of precedence? Whose lost item are you supposed to return first? And there's this, your rabbi takes precedence. What if he's your rabbi, he says, but the rabbi needs the student? That's what Rav Chisda asked Rav Huna. And Rav Huna says, are you talking about me? What, you think I need you? Chisda, he says, you need me, I don't need you. Okay? So they had this interesting relationship. They were it was like a Rav Chaver kind of thing, like a Rav, but a colleague. Now, Rav Huna was a Rav colleague to Rav Chisda, and he was very offended. And then they don't see each other for 40 years. Rav Chisda doesn't come into the Beit Midrash. Okay? And that's why only when Rav Huna died did he allow himself to go back into Rav Huna's Beit Midrash. Okay, there's a lot of interesting things about them. You could read about it more in the book Sages of Rabbi Lau in volume 5. Anyway, there's interesting history about the two of them. They end up both fasting for 40 days because they're upset that he accused him and he's upset that he was accused, and the whole thing that he got upset. There's a whole interesting story, but that really has nothing to do with our case, but it does explain why he only goes into the Beit Midrash after Rav Huna dies. So now, he goes into the Beit Midrash, and the first question he asks, there's actually a bunch of stories about when Rav Huna died and what Rav Chisda did, but he comes into the Beit Midrash, he says, Rav contradicts himself. Why? Now, he doesn't really explain himself, and for this, Rav Yosef's going to have to come in and explain, and then the Gemara is going to have a whole big problem with this whole explanation. In the end, we're going to reject all of this, okay? But right now, we're going to go with it. So, Rav Chisda comes into the Beit Midrash, and he says, how could Rav have said, Umi amar Rav, tzitzit ein tzricha bracha? Does Rav really say you don't make a bracha when you make the tzitzit? V'ha amar Rav Yehuda amar Rav, Rav was quoted by Rav Yehuda as saying, Minayin the tzitzit b'ovei kochavim she psula. How do you know that if a non-Jew made tzitzit, it's disqualified? Shene'emal. This is because it says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael v'asu lahem tzitzit. Speak to the Jewish people and make for them tzitzit. How do you explain this? B'nei Yisrael yasu v'lo avdei kochavim yasu. Well, the commandment was to the Jewish people. That means only the Jewish people can, if you notice in the pasuk it says, asu, to make the tzitzit. So only the Jewish people can make tzitzit and not people who are not Jewish. So B'nai Yisrael will make and not the avdei kochavim yasu. So that's his contradiction. Okay, that doesn't really seem to contradict, right? All it says is Jews need to make the tzitzit, not non-Jews. It doesn't say anything about making a bracha. And somehow he thinks that this means Jews are supposed to make a bracha on making tzitzit. So we're left with a little bit of confusion here. What's happening? Comes the Gemara and asks, Hi, my Rumia, why is this a contradiction? What does one have to do with the other? To which Amar Rav Yosef, Kasava Rav Chisda, Rav Yosef comes and explains. Rav Chisda held that kol mitzvah, that there's a correlation between whether a Gentile is allowed to do a mitzvah, to do an action of preparing something for a mitzvah. That is directly correlated to, does the Jew need to make a blessing? And we're going to see right now. So this is what Rav Yosef is explaining. That Rav Chisda must have held the following. And that's why he asked the question. Kol mitzvah shekshera b'ovei kochavim. Okay, again, every time it says ovei kochavim, mine says ovei kochavim, yours might say goy, some other word. Okay, there's all different words used because of the censorship. So I'm just reading what appears in my Gemara. But if it's kshera b'ovei kochavim, let's just call it a non-Jew. If a non-Jew can do it, b'Yisrael ein sarich levarech. If a non-Jew can do something like make tzitzit, for example, then the Jew does not make a bracha if the Jew does it. And you can see why. It makes logical sense, right? If a non-Jew can do it, it sounds like there's no real commandment to actually make the object. You just have to have the object ready, and then the mitzvah is that you make the blessing on is to do the action. But if it has to be done by a Jew, can't be done by someone who's not a Jew, then the Jew needs to make a blessing. Okay? And therefore, again, Rav said, non-Jew can't make tzitzit. That would then lead to, if the non-Jew can't do it and only the Jew, then the Jew should make a blessing on it. Why did Rav say the Jew should make a blessing? That seems like a clear contradiction. The problem is we're going to check this principle. Does it really work? So first we're going to check it from one direction. Uklala, who is this a real principle? V'harei milah. Brit milah. Kshera be'ovei kochavim. Okay, you might be surprised by this. but a non-Jew can actually perform a Brit Milah. Ditanya, Ir she'em ba Rofei Yisrael. Well, we're going to see, maybe not, but right now we're going to see yes, okay? Ir she'em ba Rofei Yisrael. If there's no Jewish doctor, it's interesting, they call them doctors, the people who did the Brit Milah. Right, nowadays, some people do it with a doctor, some people do it with a mohel, right? They don't say mohel. But there's no Rofei Yisrael. V'yesh ba Rofei Aramai v'Rofei Kuti. Yimol Aramai v'al yamul Kuti. Divrei Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, wear Kuti v'lo Aramai. There's a big debate. What if it's a Kuti? What if it's a non-Jew? I'm not going to get into all the details about this machloket. The main thing is, each one thinks either a Kuti or a regular non-Jew can do it. So, either which way, right, whichever one you prefer, the Kuti or the non-Jew, but it seems it can be done. Now, B'Yisrael, do we make a bracha on a Brit Milah? Of course we do. B'Yisrael tzarich levarech, Tamar Mar, Hamal Omer, Baruch Hashem Kedasham Tzav Tzivanu, Al HaMilah. The one who does the Brit Milah makes the bracha. Okay, it's a little bit different this case from the tzitzit, or potentially, right? Or if we go to sukkah, let's take sukkah, it's a better example, right? You're building something that you're going to then use for the mitzvah. The Brit Milah is the mitzvah, but okay, I'm going to leave that question aside, but it is a little bit of a question here. Now, they say, okay, so here we have a contradiction because we have a machloket between two Tanaim. Both think that a non-Jew can do it. It's just a matter of which one is preferable, which type of non-Jew. Again, assuming we view Kutim as non-Jews, which is a whole question of itself. I don't want to get into that today. We'll never finish our daf. But the point being that it seems like both think it's fine. And if it can be done by a Jew, according to the way Rav Chisda or Rav Yosef explained Rav Chisda, right, that we're assuming there's a correlation here. If it can be done by a non-Jew, then you should make a bracha. And you see they do, so that seems to go against the principle that they explain. To which they answer, wait a minute. Midu tam ela l'Rav. Rav Chisda was asking, according to Rav specifically. Right now, Rav mifsal pasul. He actually doesn't allow a non-Jew to do a Brit Milah. Even though two Tanaim said they can, he says no way. Remember, Rav has status like a Tana. He can argue against them, even though he's an Amora. De'itmar minayin l'milah b'ovei kochavim shepsula. So we have two different opinions here. One is Daru Bar Papa, you might remember him, he's one of the Bar Papas from the Siyum that we always say. And he says in the name of Rav, and Rabbi Yochanan gives a different reason, how we know that a Gentile is not allowed to do a Brit Milah. Okay, Brit Milah is not kosher if someone non-Jewish does it. So Rav quotes the Pasuk, Atah Briti Tishmor, this is my covenant. The Brit Milah is covenant between God and the Jewish people. Makes sense that a non-Jew wouldn't be able to do it. And Rabbi Yochanan says it's because of the double language, Himol Yimol, which we darshan as Hamal Yimol. The one who gets the Brit Milah, he does the Brit Milah. Okay, someone who can't. Okay, so anyway, we've rejected that as a question on this whole principle that Rav Yosef explained in explaining Rav Chisda, because it's not what Rav holds, so it doesn't matter. Okay, Rav holds Gentile can't do it, and the Jew makes a bracha. That all fits in very well. But now we're going to say the following. Sukkah mesayela, tefillin havit yufta. Sukkah is another support for this theory, but tefillin is going to be a problem. And on account of that, we're going to reject this explanation of Rav Chisda, of Rav Yosef explaining Rav Chisda. So let's see. Hare sukkah, dikshera b'ovei kochavim, detanya, sukkat goyim, sukkat nashim, sukkat behema, sukkat kutiyim, sukkah mikol makom kshera. Any kind of sukkah you have, it could be a sukkah built by a non-Jew. It could be a sukkah. This isn't built by women. It's a sukkah. Okay, this is actually a confusing line because the first one and the last one are talking about Ovei Kochavim or Kutim who built the sukkah. Okay, it's a sukkah built by Gentiles or built by Kutim. The two middle ones, the Sukkat Nashim, the Sukkat Behema, are a sukkah built for women, like perhaps like a weaving circle that women were going to have, and they built a sukkah for them. And if you remember, women are exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah, so it wasn't, the main point being it wasn't built for the mitzvah of sukkah. Okay. Now, also, obviously, if a Gentile builds it, the Gentile can't really build something for the purpose of a mitzvah. Okay, even if they could theoretically say, "I'm building this for a Jew for his mitzvah," but the Gentile is not within the realm of mitzvot, so there's no lishma, like they're building it for the sake of a sukkah. Anyway, the point being, a woman, or if it was built for animals, okay, we have this structure that was built either by Gentiles or built for women, for behemot, not for the sake of a sukkah, or any kind of sukkah you have, in any case is fine, as long as there's one thing, which you probably may know, okay, well, you have to put the schach on k'halacha, okay, it has to have schach k'halacha, and you remember we learned ta'aseh v'lo menasui, you're going to have to put the schach on for the sake of the mitzvah of sukkah. Okay, that's the important part, but the structure can have been built for something else. Ubi Yisrael ain't sarich levarech. Now you don't make a blessing. Livnot sukkah. There's no blessing like that. Okay, so how do we know this? Tanya says sukkah latzmo when you build your own sukkah. Omer baruch Hashem Elokeinu melech shechiyanu v'kimanu v'yanu l'zman hazeh. Right? You all do that? No, we don't do that actually. So sorry to confuse you. It says here in the braita that you're supposed to make a shechiyanu, which is not a bracha on doing the mitzvah. Okay, we don't actually do that. Okay, we generally, the shechiyanu that we do the first night is supposed to cover also your building of a sukkah. I don't remember at what point that changed, but it does seem from this braita that you're supposed to make a shechiyanu when you build your sukkah, but most, as far as I know, you can tell me if you do it, but most people don't. As far as I know, the custom is not to do that. Anyway, Ba'al Shev, when you come to sit, that's when you make the bracha. Okay, so what you see here, sukkah can be built by a non-Jew, and that goes perfectly with what Rav Yosef explained. Rav Chisda is saying the mitzvah is to sit in the sukkah, right? That's when you make the bracha, because the building of it can be done by a non-Jew, and therefore you don't make the bracha. The ilula sukkah lo mavarech, right? There's no bracha like that. Okay, but tefillin is a tiyuvte. Tefillin is a difficulty for this theory. Why? Harei tefillin de psulot bovei kochavim. Which, okay, let's just go back again. If it's disqualified, can't do it by a non-Jew, then what's the story? Then when the Jew makes tefillin, they're supposed to make a bracha. And we're going to see there is no such bracha. Okay, and that's going to knock down the whole theory. Titane Rav Chinina berei Rava mi Pashronya, turning now to Amud Bet. Sefer Torah tefillin umezuzot ktavan min kuti ovei kochavim eved isha katan mumar, or maybe you have meshumad psulin. Okay, now we have a list of all sorts of people that can't write a Sefer Torah, tefillin, or mezuzah. Okay, a heretic, a kuti. Right? Again, these are the Samaritans. Ovei kochavim, a non-Jew. An eved, a slave. An isha, a woman. A slave, we mean a Canaanite slave. A woman, and a katan, and a minor. And a meshumad, someone who left the religion. Shene'emal, right, where they're still considered Jewish, but they don't believe in the religion anymore. Psulin, it's disqualified. Why? Shene'emal, ukshartam, uchtavtam. Because it says ukshartam next to the pasuk uchtavtam, koshe yeshna b'kshira, those who were part of the mitzvah of likshor, which are men and Jews and right all those, not to exclude, meaning to exclude all those other people. Yeshna b'ktivad, they can also write the mezuzot, and from there they get to the Sifrei Torah and the tefillin, right? Also the tefillin are connected because of the kshira. Koshe eno b'kshira eno b'ktiva. So only if you can do the kshira, that you're part of the mitzvah of kshira, are you able to do the mitzvah of ktiva. Okay, Ubi Yisrael, these are all very important halachot about women. Tomorrow, like I said, the focus is going to be more on the women tomorrow about the chayv and tzitzit, but it also comes up here. It's just not really the focus of our topic, so I don't want to spend time on it today. It's also a long daf. But the point being here that all these people are not part of that, and therefore they're not able to do the writing. This is why when they do like writing of Sifrei Torah, there's a question whether women can do it, because women aren't really supposed to be writing the Sefer Torah. There also, if the man's writing it, and anyway, you're just helping, so it's all, possibly you could do it there because you're just aiding, you're not really writing it. Okay, but anyway, if you're not b'kshira and b'ktiva, that's very famous, to be Israel, and tzarich levarech, and what do we know? You don't make a bracha on making the tefillin. So that is a problem, because according to this, what was the theory of Rav Yosef? He was explaining Rav Chisda and why Rav Chisda contradicted Rav from this other statement of Rav that really didn't say anything about making a bracha. Because if a non-Jew can't do it, then a Jew's supposed to make a bracha, and that doesn't work for tefillin. So, the Shalach Rav, and how do we know it doesn't work by tefillin? Because Shalach Rav Chia berei de Rav Huna mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan al tefillin shel yad omer baruch Hashem tzvanu la'aniach tefillin al tefillin shel rosh omer baruch Hashem tzvanu al mitzvat tefillin. Notice the brachot that there are. There's one for tefillin shel yad, there's one for tefillin shel rosh. The simple reading of this, by the way, goes more like the Ashkenazi custom that we discussed, which is to make a bracha on both, whereas the Sephardim will only make it if you speak in between, right? Make that separate bracha. Anyway, ilu la'asot tefillin lo mavrech. That's not our point, though. The main point is never a bracha to make the tefillin. So now they're going to say elalav hainu tama. So now they're going to suggest a different reason. What's the determining factor? It's not whether it's pasul or kasher for a non-Jew. The determining factor in do you make a bracha on making something, okay, like making tzitzit, making tefillin, building a sukkah, or doing the brit milah, and now they're going to get back to what I said before, which I thought was a little weird that they didn't address, Elalav hainu, we're now going to address it, and I saw when you were writing about sukkah, you were talking about this, even though the sukkah was completely talking only about if a non-Jew can do it, then it means no bracha. But now it's going to be more what you would have intuited, which is elalav hainu tama. Kol mitzvah da asiyata gemar mitzvah kigom milah. If doing it is the end of the mitzvah, the completion of the mitzvah, like a brit milah, that's the end. You've done it. Even if a Gentile is allowed to do the brit milah, it doesn't matter. The Jew still makes a bracha. In other words, the Gentile issue is irrelevant to the situation. Okay? Basically, that's not what's relevant. What's relevant is it Gemar Mitzvah or not. If it's Gemar Mitzvah, the end of the mitzvah, the completion of the fulfillment of the mitzvah, then you make the bracha, which is very intuitive. The chol, the mitzvah tasiyat alav Gemar Mitzvah, kigon tefillin, or sukkah, for example, right? That's not you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah yet by building it, right? Or even if you say that is a mitzvah, but you haven't sat in the sukkah, which is the main mitzvah. You haven't worn the tefillin, which is the main mitzvah. Right? Ukshartam, you haven't tied them on put them around, wrap them around your arm. Or put it on your head. So then, it could be disqualified by, a Gentile can't make them, but that it's irrelevant. You still don't make a bracha. So, okay. Now, according to the way I'm going to read this, it's not exactly the way I think Rashi reads it differently, but I'm going by a different commentary that I think makes a lot more sense. Now, what we did is we basically rejected everything Rav Chisda said. Rav Chisda got into the Beit Midrash and said Rav contradicts Rav, and then Rav Yosef explained how he contradicted because these two issues are interrelated, right? One talked about the bracha, one talked about can a Gentile do it or not, and we thought they were interrelated. Now we're saying they're not interrelated at all, and we're basically wiping out, we're saying that was wrong, what Rav Chisda said, and how Rav Yosef maybe explained what Rav Chisda was thinking, but that was all based on an incorrect premise. And now what they're going back to, according to the reading that I'm going with, they're now going back to, you have to remember what was the beginning of the sugya. Rav Nachman bumps into Rav Adar Ahava, sees him making a bracha on making the tzitzit, and says, what are you doing? Why are you making a bracha? Rav says you don't make a bracha. And now we're going to say, so what's the machloket between the two of them? Obviously, Rav Adar Ahava thought you should make a bracha. Ubetzitzit b'hakami palge, mar savar chovat talitu, Umar Savach Chova Gavru, exactly what we saw yesterday, which is it a chova on the beged that every garment you have that's four corners needs tzitzit, in which case you're fulfilling the mitzvah by putting on the tzitzit. That's Rav Adar Ahava. And Rav Nachman holds it's chova gavru. No, it's putting it on, and therefore you haven't completed the mitzvah until you put it on. You wouldn't make a bracha on making them. Okay, that's all one way of reading the sugya. Okay, even though we just had two ways of reading it, right? It was a whole back and forth. Now we're going to have a different version of what Rav said. That was all saying, the whole thing started with Rav Chisda, because he said Rav contradicts, because Rav says you're not supposed to make a bracha. And he also said it's kosher a Gentile can't do it, and then that was the whole question. So now they say, right, now we're going to have a different version of Rav. Amalei Rav Mordechai Rav Ashi, Atun Hachi Matnina La. You explain it this way, but Anan Hachi Matnina, but we have a different version. The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Minayin L'tzitzit Povei Kochavim Shekshera. He actually said that a Gentile, it wasn't the making the bracha that he's going to change, it's can a Gentile do it? So in the first version, he said a Gentile can't do it, which didn't seem to match when he said you can't make the bracha, you don't make a bracha. Now we're going to switch and say the Gentile can do it, which is going to work perfectly with, that's why you don't make a bracha. Okay? And then we're not going to read the whole sugya again, we're just going to read this one thing. Now, where does he get it from? The same pasuk according to this version. It's the exact opposite way of reading the pasuk, which is always interesting. Shneimar daber b'nei Yisrael v'asu lahem tzitzit, yasu lahem achile. How do you read this? Speak to the Jewish people, and now how do you read this? Asu lahem tzitzit. There's something weird. If it was the Jews should make their own tzitzit, it should say asu lachem, make for you, make for yourselves. It says asu lahem, meaning someone else will make for them, for the Jews. Sounds like someone else who would be someone else, if not non-Jews. And therefore you learn from that same words, it actually means non-Jews make the tzitzit for the Jews, okay, that they can. So, and then that would go perfectly well with, then you don't make a bracha on making them, according to Rav Yosef and Rav Chisda, right, the way Rav Yosef understood Rav Chisda. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, a different statement about tzitzit. We're moving on to a different topic. As'an min hakotzin u'min hanimin u'min hagradim psula min hasising kshera. If you take it from thorny threads that are sticking out of your garment, or minanimim, or from threads that you sewed the garment with that are hanging down, threads. We've talked about this before. Or gradim, when you're weaving the garment, there's threads that come from the outside, right? Let's say you have a woven garment and you want to threads, you want to sew something in that garment, like sew the edge or something. But the gradim are the parts the threads you use for the weaving that are left over. Okay, so those are different kind of threads. Anyway, they're all disqualified. Mina sisim, but if you take it from a spool of yarn, something like that, like a spool of thread, it's kshera. Okay, you're going to see in a minute what they're talking about here, why this is relevant, or what the uniqueness about the sisin are, why we have to say it is. Ki Amaritha came to Shmuel, but Rav Yehuda says when I said this in front of Shmuel, which is usually after Rav died, he went to Shmuel. We have a lot of after deaths today, and things that shift, right? So, af minasisim psula be'inan tfiya lishma. You can't even take it from a spool of thread. Why? Because you need the thread to be spun lishma. So now we have this machloket, and that's why the first one said minasisim. It's fine because it doesn't need the threads. Don't need to be prepared l'shem tzitzit. What has to be l'shem tzitzit when you put them in the garment? But not the making of the threads, the making of the raw materials. Whereas the second opinion is, Shmuel says, you need tefiyah lishma. Even the earlier stage needs to be lishma. Kitanai, they say this machloka, Rav and Shmuel, is based on machloka Tanaim about tefillin. We're going to see it, but it's the same idea. Tzipan zahav, okay, the first line is not relevant really, but if you cover the tefillin with gold, and imagine gold boxes on your tefillin, right? Or gold, they actually mean the leather part of the tefillin is gold, okay? Instead of leather, you use gold, or Oshetala lehem or behemat me'ap psulot. Okay, or you put leather of a non-kosher animal, disqualified, or behemat torak kshirot. If it's a kosher animal, though, it's kshirot. Even if it wasn't prepared, the hide wasn't prepared, right, wasn't processed, l'shem mitzvah tefillin, for the sake of the mitzvah. He says even the preparation of the raw materials of the tanning of the leather has to be done l'shem mitzvah tefillin. So that's a big debate we have here, both between these two Tanaim and tefillin, and by these two Amoraim and tzitzit. Amar le Abaye le Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yehuda. Now we're going to see how we prepare the tchelet. So hai tzcheta hechitza v'yitula. So how do you dye it? How do you prepare it? Amarle, maitina dam chilason. You take the blood of the chilason, visamanim, and some other herbs, which are supposed to help the dye to stick to the cloak and to the cloth and stay in it. Viramina luhu biyoren. You put them all in a big pot. Umer tachinale. That's added here. Wasn't in the original text, or it probably was, but wasn't in the printed text. They added it, and you boil them up. V'shaklinam porta bebeata. You take a little bit in an eggshell. You take a little eggshell. You'll see in a minute why we do this. Why just a little amount? Okay, obviously you can put it in a little small bowl, but they didn't really have little teeny bowls, so they said put it in an eggshell. V'ta'amina lehu be'udra, and then you test it on a little piece of wool. V'shadina lehe lehu bi'ata. Then you throw out the egg. V'kalina lehe le'udra, and you burn the swatch that you just dyed to test the color. Shmami natzlat. You can learn 3 things from here, things that we discussed already. Shmami nat ti'ima psula. The swatch that you tested it on is disqualified. You can't use it for tzitzit. And that's again because it's not lishma, right? Ushmami na debi'inan tzviya lishma. It sounds like you need to dye it l'shem the mitzvah. And that's why the testing isn't good. That sounds like one and the same thing. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Ushmami na ta'ama psala. It also teaches you that when you use dye for testing, whatever dye is in that bowl or eggshell is disqualified also, even though, right, you can't use the dye that was used to test. Whatever's left of that dye you have to throw away. That's what it said. And that's because that disqualifies. So if, for example, you put the swatch into the whole big cauldron that you were boiling everything and you would ruin everything. Okay, those first 2 are really one and the same. Why does it say we learned 3 things from there when 2 are really one and the same? Rav Ashi matam kamar matam tima psula mishum debi'inan tzviya lishma. The second one is coming to explain the first one, which really means shmami not 2 things and not really 1, but not really 3. Okay, but what it's really saying is those 2 really are one and the same. Don't think it means something different. Kitanai, and now we're going to see there's a machloket Tanaim about this. Tima psula mishum shenemar kalil techelet divrei Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel. He actually quotes Klil Tchelet, just so you don't be confused. It's not about tzitzit. It's talking about the color Tchelet. In the Bigdei Kuna, on the Kohen's clothes, also there were things that were dyed this Tchelet color. And there, because it says klil tchelet, again, it's a little hard to understand how they darshan it from there, but it means the whole thing has to be tchelet, so they learn that the testing is no good, you have to dye it for the purpose of the tchelet. Rabbi Yochanan ben Davai omer, afilu mar esheni shebakasher mishum shenemar ushni tolat. You can actually, they're using to say that you can actually use, oh yes, thank you for pointing out this week's parsha. You can actually use, which reminds me about all sorts of things in the parsha that yesterday that were very relevant to things we were learning both in the Haftorah, if you remember all the years of the Beit HaMikdash when it was built, and we had all the chronology of when the Mishkan was where and all that, and then also obviously the menorah and all the parts. Okay, anyway, he says Mar'esh Sheni Sheba Kasher because it says Shni Tolat. Now Shni Tolat often goes with Tchelet. Okay, it's the color scarlet. And a lot of things in the Mishkan were dyed also that color. And the point being here, Shni Tolat, now Shni doesn't really mean this, but the drash is Shnei, Mishni, the second time. Even after you've dyed and you've weakened the dye a little bit, you can still do it again. Okay, so this seems to say that's not a problem. So there's a machloket about this. Okay, we're going to end with the last part here. Tanu Rabbanan, a braita, tchelet ein la b'dika. Now the way they understand this right now, although we're going to have a problem with it later, get to that tomorrow, but it sounds like it's impossible to test to make sure, well, also debate about this, but let's say to make sure it's really that color and it's not kali ilan that we saw as the fake, tchelet. And that's why you can't really purchase it unless it's someone who's an expert that you can trust, that they're not fooling you and selling you kali ilan, which is much cheaper to make. Tefillin yesh len b'dika. Tefillin you could check. Rashi says we're talking about chaserot and yeterot, that it was written properly. Okay, that you have the right, like Yud and Vav when it needs it, when it doesn't need it. But you still don't purchase it only from an expert. Why only from an expert? Rashi says, because this is what we had a machloket about before, the ibud, the processing of the leather needs to be done lishma, and if it's not, then it's disqualified and you have no way to know that because it all just depends on what their thoughts are, what they're thinking. You can check them for, again, that everything was written properly. And you can buy them from anyone because they don't need ibud lishma. And from there they say, really? There's no way to test it. And then they're going to have a whole thing about how people test it. We're going to leave that for tomorrow. It's a long sugya. Okay, so what did we have today? A lot of different things. We started with the minimum size that the tzitzit are supposed to be after the twinings. And then also where on the beggar they're supposed to be, what the minimum maximum distance from the corner is. From there we got to how you thread the threads in, 3 different opinions about it. Then we had the whole thing about the bracha, which we had a big debate about. Do you make a bracha? Do you not make a bracha? What really is it based on? We thought it was based on something, which then, Rav Chisda raised contradiction. In the end, we said that's not really what it's based on. Then we said the machlok is actually based on this issue of, right, the what determines do you make a bracha on making something is it the Gemara mitzvah or not? Like Brit Milah is, tefillin and tzitzit making them is not the Gemara mitzvah. Although then there was a machloket because one said it is the Gemara mitzvah if you say it's a chovah on the beggar and not on the person. And then we just ended with the what you can make the tzitzit out of, and then this thing about the tzitzit. Can you just use a spool of thread, or does it have to be from what part, at what point of the process do you have to already be doing it l'shem mitzvah tzitzit? From the making of the threads, same with the tzitzit of the making of with the tefillin of the making of the leather or not. And then we finished about the te'ima and the tester, which also has to do with this issue of lishma that has to be made for the sake of the mitzvah and not for the sake of testing. And with that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.